Hit record. Excellent, thank you. So we'll get started, and hopefully Mr. Morris will join us in short time. I'll make my screen a little bit bigger so we can see the ears. I guess if David, while you're in the background, if you could reach out to Mr. Morris and just make sure that everything's well. Thank you. So good afternoon to the CIP Advisory Committee. My name is Andy Bowman. I am the Chief of Budget within the Department of Finance and Budget. And I'll be covering most of the staff portion of the presentation today. As I did last time, I want to thank Maya Kumazawa, who is the school's Director of Budget and Planning. She has a lot of ideas and partnership that went into shaping this presentation, as well as the staff in Finance and Budget, who prepared much of the content here, Tia Mitchell and Ryan Davidson. Before we start into any content, I would like just to take a moment for the 6 committee members to introduce themselves to the public who will be watching. And after the committee introduces themselves, we'll have staff introduce themselves along the way. So I'll start with our Board of Supervisors members.
I'm Supervisor Donna Price, Scottsville Magisterial District.
Supervisor Bila Pisto-Kirtley, Rivanna Magisterial District.
And our school board representatives.
Kate Acuff, Jack Jewett District.
Jono Alcaro at large.
And our Planning Commission representative.
Karen Firehawk, Planning Commissioner for the Sam Miller District and representing the Planning Commission on the committee.
Thank you all for your time and participation in this process, and we'll allow Mr. Morris to introduce himself. He is the community representative on this committee. So we'll go ahead to the next slide for the agenda today. We're going to be picking up first from where we left on November 23rd with a recap of what took place. We will then go over some additional information around revenues that fund the draft CIP and some next steps related to those revenues, talking about where we've been and where we are now and where we will be going. We'll then return to the recommendations of the committee to leave as much time as we can for committee discussion. And I'll say today that as I shared the presentation with the committee in advance, there will be some more numbers and dense information. So if we have questions along the way, we'll try and take breaks along the way to make sure we're not going too in depth, and so we hit all those questions at the end. So at the end of the day, we will have a committee discussion on whether we need to have consensus on the committee recommendation at this meeting or whether to hold the December 10th meeting. Staff is fully prepared to support the committee in whatever choice they take, knowing that we made a decision last time to not go into any revenue information just because of how dense it was on top of the information we were already shared. That may naturally cause itself to have a third meeting, but that's not a decision we make right now. We can talk about that later as we work through this agenda. So with that said, we'll go on to a recap of the first meeting. Just before we dive into content, this is just going to be a quick version of what we talked about. We started with the charge of the committee, which was shared with the joint board meeting in October, as well as the Planning Commission in November. And beyond this charge, I should highlight kind of sort of where is this all leading to? The final deliverable at the end of this committee's work is going to be a letter that will include a recommendation to the county executive for his deliberation as we prepare the fiscal year 23 budget. I'll note that in the past, in addition to projects, that letter has included comments from the committee as well. For example, last year, this committee expressed their support to prioritize funding for broadband initiatives. It wasn't necessarily a capital project, but it was on the committee's mind as we were, certainly it's an area of mutual interest for the public schools and county government. It's been a strategic priority of county government. And even though there was not a clear capital project for it, the committee felt very compelled to express their support. And so there would be the opportunity for the committee as well as we prepare a memo to also include any statements around that would be considered. And that memo will just not go to the county executive. That will be shared with the entire board, the entire school board, school staff, the planning commission. So it kind of, whether it be at the end of today or the end of our meeting on the 10th, the committee will include some direction and a recommendation. Staff will prepare that memo and we'll work with the committee to finalize that before we report that out to everyone. So moving on to the schedule that we talked about last time. And I thought about this schedule preparing for this meeting is that we show this as a continual line, but I often think of this as a staircase or perhaps it's a mountain that we're climbing where one step leads to each other and to reach a long-term goal. So this committee's work is important, and that recommendation will inform our long-range process. But it's also not the first starting place where we've been, as there's already been a lot of long-range planning work that was done through the school's long-range planning session, through the joint work session we held in October, and through the other long-range planning guidance documents that set the direction for the county. And when we end on December 10th or today, whichever that may be, there will also continue to be discussions by the board and school board about the county's long-range financial direction. And I'll allude to what some of those will be later. So we then spent some time going through a draft CIP, and it was put together using this slide of concepts as a guide. First, starting with the fiscal year 22 appropriated budget. That includes projects that started in the fiscal year 22 for projects, as well as projects that were approved in prior years that had not yet been completed. From that base, we then moved to identify obligations, maintenance, and replacement programs. I should note that's not automatic funding as staff performs their due diligence to scrub those requests. And I'll add that kind of second layer as we think about it, maintenance and replacement, that is informed by the county's financial policies adopted by the board of supervisors that note that there's intent to protect the county's capital investment and minimize future maintenance and replacement costs. So finally, after those kind of A and B on the slide are addressed, we would then look at additional projects which were prioritized as a starting point with 4 criteria shown on the slide. So moving to the next slide, this was the very high level 30,000 foot view. And then we went down to another level of detail with this pyramid that we see on the screen. And so we start at the bottom with the green piece of the pyramid, which included funding already in the fiscal year 22 appropriated budget, items approved July 1st and years prior that are not complete. We then move to the middle piece of the pyramid, which is those projects with maintenance, replacement, and obligations. And then finally, we talked about the 131 million to be the focus of the CIP Advisory Committee for those projects above and beyond that. And kind of as we get into a little more detail, we then wanted to follow one new slide we did not look at before, but it's kind of in response to a question that came up last time. Is of that 131 million, how is that allocated among public schools and county government? And so just for that top of the pyramid, we can see that that 131 million is split 59% to the public schools, 23% to county government, and 18% is a placeholder for future projects that would be determined in a subsequent capital process, whether that be next year or future, whether they be for things that may emerge from the updated county government strategic plan, the update of the county's comprehensive plan that's underway, or just being awareness of that there are community discussions that will be taking place that may have other long-term capital needs that would need to be planned for. The intent in this year's process is not to explain what that 18% would be for, but just to reserve some capacity in the future as we begin to work or maybe emerge from a time of increased uncertainty with the pandemic to be a little more stable ground, but recognize that we still are living in a pandemic. So moving on back to a slide we've seen before, these are the $131 million worth of projects from fiscal year 23 to 27. These are listed in alphabetical, not priority order. Whether a project is number 1 or 2 or number 3 for purposes of the initial draft plan isn't as important because they are included in the plan. One of the questions we posed last time, and we'll continue to look for the feedback from the committee, is are these projects in the draft CIP the right list? This was a starting point prepared by staff, but it's reasonable that others could have different opinions, that there's something in there that maybe either shouldn't be. There could also be a question about the flexibility and timing. And those, as we work through the fiscal year 23 budget process, can address that as we need to. So we covered what was included in that 131 million, but it's also very important to acknowledge what's not in that 131 million. This includes a list of county government projects and a list of public school projects. We'll not discuss them in detail this time because we shared information and discussed them some last. Now, the same point I made last time is that the exclusion of these projects is not a criticism of their merit when we consider them in isolation, but rather looking at the collective criteria that in our total available revenue that was available to fit them in the current draft CIP. So we also discussed on the next slide, there are also projects that are not in the plan that are not yet identified. It's sort of the bottom half of the slide, the future needs on the horizon. There are community discussions and with our county's regional partners, whether it be the regional jail, the regional library, the regional emergency communication center, partners in our volunteer fire rescue system, and there may be other government requests that come forward. We discussed last time just a difference where the schools are charged to prepare a needs-based funding request, and that is what that funding request. Local government's request was not a needs-based approach, recognizing that the volume of work that needed to be completed. Not to acknowledge that one approach is better than the other, but those are two different starting points, and there are reasons for why those are different. So the final point I'll make in this slide is that, sorry, if we could just go back one moment, is that we have 457 million total that's requested, and there is 267 million that was included in the draft CIP. So there's a difference of 190 million that is requested but not included. Of course, that 190 million, when we think of the long-term picture, is likely greater than that because of those noted examples on the bottom, just for perspective in terms of some dollars and what's in and what's out. So now moving to the next slide, we'll kind of work through some information, but we'll come back at the end of today to continue discussion of the committee to determine a recommendation, or the committee can adopt to hold a December 10th meeting that will finalize a recommendation. What staff will be listening for, because I recognize that particularly in this virtual Zoom environment, this committee discussion can be a challenging thing. So we may not reach the end of a recommendation today, and that's perfectly fine. But if there's items or information that staff can prepare as we work together to support the committee, to identify information that will help the committee to do their best work to present a recommendation to the county executive, that's specific feedback that we'll be looking for later today. So before I move into any new content, I just wanted to pause to see if there are any committee member questions or comments about this recap. I ran through this quick, but again, it was a much shorter version than we did last time. I'll just ask for a show of hands rather than going through the list, recognizing that many may not have any comments. Mr. Alcaro.
Am I off mute? Yes. Hi. I just have a couple of questions. I didn't really get to see this until late in the morning. I was involved with other projects. These are just nitpick questions, but on page 8, where it has an 18% set aside placeholder for strategic plan and comp plan, that is for the county, correct?
I would say that when we originally drafted that, my thought was we're going to have a county government strategic plan and a comprehensive plan that would be, obviously the comprehensive plan influences our entire community, but much of that is related to local government infrastructure. However, there is no requirement that 18% be devoted to anything in particular. There really are no strings attached.
Sure.
It really would be
I was just trying to
decided
understand, because when I saw comp plan, I thought of compensation plan.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, comprehensive plan.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. That was a comment that if I didn't make earlier, that 18% could be applied to anything in the capital budget.
Okay, and the other question was, when the prioritization was done for the 131, how was that determined? What was the process behind that? Because obviously there are a number of things that we have the interest in that were left out, as you put,
sure,
rightly so in the next slide.
So if we could maybe go to that slide 9, just to pull it up so we're all looking at the same thing. So we started with those criteria to document, which I mentioned before. We don't need to go back to that slide. Really, the strategic plans connection and kind of that new reality in the pandemic and those things we would look for. And so we began to, particularly in the local government projects, we created a matrix that we shared with the committee before the first meeting. It sort of had the projects, a brief description, and just kind of these 4 criteria and just a high level assessment of those would be. So we looked at the strategic plan connection. We looked at potential barriers for the ability to execute, the ongoing operating impacts of those projects, and the equity statement that we had for each project. And so we began as county government beginning to identify, kind of working with our finance and budget staff, reaching out with the input we have from other departments, partnering with the county executive office, figures the county government, where does that really line up in terms of what our priorities would be. And so we began to shape that as a staff level, and then reach out to school staff, Ms. Kumazawa and Ms. Rosalind Schmidt, the school operating officer, and recognizing that there are some very large, well-justified projects in the school division that we need to fit in as well. The long range planning committee provided some recommendations for what was in there. And so we know that at the top of that list was the first couple, well, I'll say the first 3 years are the 2 schools that are included, with high school capacity and elementary school. So recognizing that, where we would go next, sort of what, I've been getting their feedback in terms of, recognizing that we're not able to fund everything. Have we truly missed the mark on anything? And so this is where is our discussion. I'll say one thing is when I was originally going through the request, I'll appreciate the school staff for pointing this out to me, is that the indoor air quality project brings a substantial amount of federal funding with that and really leveraging our local match. And so that was one of the first pass where they immediately said, though it was a little bit of down the list, when we looked at our criteria and the overall operating impact, I think it's approximately a $4.5 million project that's 2/3 provided with federal funding. That was one where it said it really makes sense in our new reality and our pandemic, even though the benefits of that extend beyond the pandemic, to really include that. So we began to have discussions as well to kind of show with them that I think the next project was elementary school number 2, which is approximately $40 million project. And as we looked at that, some of the challenge to fit that into the plan with the other constraints we have. And as I'll talk through the revenues today, sort of give a sense of that modeling and why that it was the way it was to give the committee the comfort as we talked about that. But this certainly was a staff-driven process. In the past, we've had, I think probably the last 4 years, probably 4 different capital processes that have ranged everything from starting with board priorities to more kind of scientific criteria to this high-level approach to last year's sort of pandemic short version. So that's how we got to this point. But this is really intended to be a starting point for the committee to then take this work, apply their judgment, and modify that as they need to.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bowman.
Any other questions from the committee?
Well, we have our hands up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Mr. Bowman, thank you. And I do want to acknowledge that you have provided an advanced copy of these slides earlier today, but could you go to the next slide, number 10, please? I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss something.
Thank you. And I will too acknowledge that while I provided these in advance, it was about 10 o'clock, and recognize that you all are both elected officials and individuals through your own lives. I do understand that everyone did not have a chance to go through this in detail. So all questions are welcome.
All right, thank you. And I would say that on the not included in the draft CIP under county government, the full requested increases to baseline maintenance and replacement amounts is something that I would like us to discuss a little bit further, because it's sort of a pay me now, pay me later. If we don't adequately maintain what we've got, then the cost of maintenance will simply go up. Thank you.
Thanks. We can flag that for a later discussion. Supervisor Lepisto-Kirtley.
Yes, so staying on this one, I realize that we have elementary school capacity number 1, but not number 2. Is that because of the cost, or is that because the school district feels that at this time that doesn't need to be in the CIP? I mean, I'm concerned about elementary school enrollment.
Yeah, I always hesitate to speak for the school board, so I will ask Dr. Acuff, who has her hand up already. So. You're on mute, Dr. Acuff.
This was not a school board decision. And in fact, the 2 elementary schools in critical need are Baker Butler, which in the next school year will be 90 students over capacity. And if we don't do it, and by the 26-27 school year, it'll be 160 students over. They already have 6 trailers outside. And Mountain View, by 26-27, it'll be almost 190 students over capacity. So there's no real, and they have 12 classrooms in trailers. So there's not a clear choice between the 2. We really need to do both of them within the next 5 years.
Okay, and are we talking about increasing capacity there, or are you talking about building an additional school?
For both, we're talking about two new schools, one at the Brook Hill site to relieve the northern feeder pattern overcrowding, and one that will cleave the Mountain View community into 2 400 to 500 student schools. For that one, we of course will also need land acquisition. But we are adding a few classrooms this year in the next calendar year, but that will not even easily accommodate the students that are over right now. But we've had our community meetings and we've gotten community support for adding another elementary school in that feeder pattern.
And
So we
so,
will have, so
go ahead.
this year we're working on the western feeder pattern. We're having the 35,000 square foot addition to Crozet. And then now the northern and the western southern feeder patterns need attention too.
So what you're saying is elementary school capacity number 2, be it
Baker Butler or
Baker Butler or the other one, that should be in our CIP original.
I strongly believe that.
Okay, and can I ask, okay, and we took it out, Andy, because of financial concerns, is that it?
Yeah, I would say in this draft CIP, it's not included. But one of the things I hope to show this committee today is the possibility for additional projects to be in there. There's not on the slide, but for perspective, that's number 2 school is around about a $40 million project. If we were to, the Biscuit Run project over those 4 years is around $8 million. And we were to look at the Northern Convenience Center and Street Sweeper, I guess between those 3 projects combined, we're in the ballpark of about $10 million in local government projects. So aside from that, we still have that future capacity in transportation. But part of that is just the relative size of not every project is equal, included because, or there's not a question of staff or whether the merit or justification of that. This is based on the financial information we had now to start with.
Okay.
Talk through the revenues as we come back. And I think this is helpful discussion as we're starting already. Is really today or the 10th, really getting what are those priorities that the committee would like to see. And if the committee were to advise the county executive and staff that elementary school number 2 really should be the first thing in, that's the direction that we can take. And then as revenues change and improve, we'll know exactly where to go to be responsive to the committee's direction. I think as I talk to the revenue side in just a few slides, we'll sort of say where we are and what might be possible and what will be coming in discussions with future revenue policy decisions by the school board and the board of supervisors that can continue to shape this plan.
Okay, and still in the realm of discussion would be maybe a possible bond or referendum for the schools.
I'll talk about our bond revenue assumptions, revenues as well.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you. If you could go back to screen number 9, another question.
Sure.
The transportation leveraging program, is that leveraging with state and federal entities? That's why
yes,
it's
that is correct.
Okay. So that's why it would be conducive for us to do something like that because we are able to maximize our monies. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is also aligned with the board's strategic plan. And that is a project that has very low, if any, operating impacts.
Okay.
Yes.
And the last one, the street sweeper, is that doing it on our own or in the past we've done it with Charlottesville?
We have not been able to do it with Charlottesville. This would be doing that on our own. And I see Trevor Henry, our assistant county executive. I don't know if you would like to elaborate on the history of this.
Sure, Trevor Henry, assistant county executive. Thanks, Andy. Thanks for the question. We did have a small pilot with the city of Charlottesville to leverage their existing equipment and operators. We have been unable to obtain an agreement or an MOU or anything, quite frankly, to move forward with it. This request would bring both the equipment and then the operating piece of it in under our own control. It will be primarily in our development area, and it does help improve things like TMDL. I mean, it's in addition to just the aesthetic side, there's a safety element, and so this has been a priority for the board for many years, and we've just been unable to land an agreement without bringing this infrastructure in ourselves. So
okay, no. Thank you, Mr. Henry. I do agree it has been a priority for the board. I was just wondering if maybe in another, let's say, couple months, that if there's some stability in our neighboring in Charlottesville, that perhaps that could be, we could still have the opportunity to have a joint working relationship with them, and that would prove to be less costly.
We've been working this since 2016. I would say this is one we should take under our own control.
Okay.
And relative to everything else, this is pretty minor in the CIP.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much. No more questions.
So Commissioner Firehawk has her hand up.
Yes, I'll try to be brief. I just want to make a quick note too regarding the schools that, of course, that is lack of school capacity is one of the primary reasons that the Planning Commission would be likely to deny a special use permit or an application that required a rezoning. So that weighs very heavily in whether we recommend to the board that they deny the application. So it does have the effect of stopping growth potentially. The other thing I wanted to just ask, maybe staff could comment on, I'm trying to get an understanding. I've seen the plans for Biscuit Run, but I'd like to get a better understanding of the degree to which the county has investigated alternative sources of funding for trail or access construction beyond the county's own CIP. But there are other grants available potentially, and I'm just curious to what degree they've been investigated.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. Trevor, it looks like he was about to lean in if you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, I can't to a certain degree. It'd be better if we had Bob Krickenberger on to answer that. But we have applied for a VDOT recreational access grant that is part of the current project that is being design being finalized, and will hopefully go to construction in the spring to summer. Next round, I would have to take that as a lookup, and certainly our Parks Department is good at aggressively going after grant programs. I'm not aware of any others that are being brought to bear on this one, but I know with the federal funding that is out there and available, there may be some opportunities there that we would pursue.
Yeah, I mean, there may be more money for parks, but I guess one of the things I think is tricky about Biscuit Run, and this is one thing I'm not clear on, you might be able to comment on as well, Trevor, is because it's state land that's essentially being leased to us to develop, would we be able to apply to the state for trail development grants? Because we don't own it. That's what I'm confused about.
We are able to do that for a VDOT grant. So
okay.
if that is precedent, then I would say yes. But
okay.
Andy, we can take that as a lookup and get back to the committee.
Yes, I'll add that Mr. Krickenberger, our Director of Parks and Recreation, has joined the call. Bob, I'm not sure if you heard the full question, but if you could speak to some of the grant status and the work that you all do with Biscuit Run. And if you need to hear the question again in full, please ask. Or perhaps we have a connection issue.
His hand is
He's
up.
muted.
His hand is up. He may be muted.
Yeah.
It's my mistake. Terribly sorry. Where do I begin? Biscuit Run. We've looked into various grant opportunities in regards to DCR with their Recreation Trails grant. We'll be looking at upcoming DCR, the Land and Water Conservation Grant. We think we are in a great position to be awarded or have some really grant-worthy projects that we will be looking into, mainly with our trails and bridge and boardwalk system. And as Mr. Henry mentioned, we have also looked into the Recreation Access Grant. Currently, with the trails, we are working with our our in-house trail building staff, as well as volunteers and partners. We already have several miles of trails on the ground, and we will continue through the winter and spring until opening. So short of it is, we are looking and pursuing some other opportunities as well.
Okay, so maybe down the road, we would be able to relieve some of that, the burden of that park. Obviously, the park, proximity to a park also raises property values, which the county that gets back in the form of real estate taxes. So it's a good investment Just wondering how much we can get the money from the state and the feds. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
If I could follow up one more on Biscuit Run, that is a top priority for parks. And just noting that the total master plan, if implemented, I believe was on the order of about $40 million. So that even this request is only getting us so far into it. So any state and federal funds that we can leverage, we certainly will pursue. But this is to build the whole master plan out will take an investment and time to do that.
I'll add to Ms. Firehawk's comment that investment of future federal funding is part of the path forward that I'll speak to in just a little bit with the revenues. But thank you for your comment. All right, I would like to welcome Mr. Morris. Mr. Morris, we are just recapping what we reviewed last time, so you have not missed any new information. And I know you've been here for a few minutes to hear this committee's discussion and where their interest is.
Thank you very much, and I apologize.
All right, so hearing no other first question, let's go ahead and move into revenues. And before we discuss any new revenue information, I'm going to call back to a couple of slides that were used at the October joint board meeting. And at that meeting, there were two initial assumptions that were presented to the board's discussion and feedback around revenues. The first was a recognition that compared to prior years, there are a number of revenue options that are available that were not available in prior years. And today I'll discuss what's been incorporated to date already and what will be considered in future board policy discussions. And some of those examples are on the top half of the slide. The final point in the slide is an assumption that the initial 5-year model would not include a change in the real estate tax rate in fiscal year 23 to 27. Additional revenues could be available from the strengthening general fund revenue picture, as well as the options listed on the top of the slide, and all of which could support emerging needs, whether they be in the capital and or the operating budget. So I know one of the questions that's on the committee's mind, that was on the board's mind that day, is, well, how does this compare to where we were pre-pandemic with the real estate tax rate assumption that was made around the fiscal year 21 to 25 to CIP? So as I talked back then, I want to go back in time, and also for Mr. Morris, Ms. Firehawk, who did not have the benefit of this information in October, is that this is a slide that was shared in the budget process of March 2020, right before the pandemic began. In the winter of 2019, the CIP Advisory Committee recommended a fiscal year 21 to CIP with a 1 cent real estate tax increase from fiscal year 21 through 26. So there would be one in each 5 years and then one that was following. How that began to play out is in the fiscal year 21 recommended budget. That first year, the tax rate was delayed. And really, when the pandemic came along, that entire budget was significantly revised. There was no 5-year CIP that was adopted with all the uncertainty. And that was really the kind of the last place we left in terms of a long-range capital plan. So a natural question would be, why wouldn't we simply pick up that prior plan? The answer is, from a principled state I'll start from, is that as part of our long-range planning, we are continuing to adapt and strategize as we learn new information. And there are two big differences than that old CIP than the current one. I say current draft. So first, as I noted before, that draft from 23 to 27, that doesn't assume a change in the real estate tax rate, which was consistent with the joint board discussion in October. And perspective, because this is a common question we get all throughout the year, is that 1 penny on the real estate tax rate is currently in fiscal year 22. That's approximately $2.2 million. So half a penny would be about $1.1 million. And as you go out in time, that value may change, but just for an approximate kind of sense of magnitude, like that's the financial impact. So the second change from 21 to 25 that is not obvious on the slide is we can see the total CIP that was recommended in 21 to 5 total $211 million for that 5 period. For comparison, this was a number that I'll bring up because it was sort of one of many numbers last time. The 23 to 27 draft CIP totals $267 million. That is about $56 million or 27% more than the CIP that was looked at from fiscal year 20 to 5. So in summary, we now have a draft CIP that's notably larger than the version that was 2 years before that, and it doesn't include the real estate tax rate increases from the year before. So I would imagine this may sound too good to be true. How did we get there? And that's what I'm going to talk through as part of our revenue assumptions for everything that has changed. I'll highlight a few of these that I'm going to kind of mention on that October 20th slide, and we'll talk about that instead. In the summer of 2021, we had a bond issuance at record low rates that has created capacity. We have done an update of our borrowing assumptions. We've had an updated revenue projection. Those are some things that are incorporated to date. There are still going to be policy options that are going to be available beyond. They were not available at all in the fiscal year 21, and they'll be available as beyond the work of this committee, working with the board and the school board around discussions around state enabling authority, leveraging federal revenues, to Ms. Firehawk's comment, and investing one-time funding. The one thing I should note is that we're also still in a pandemic, and we're also experiencing impacts to project costs, schedules, and lead times. We have adjusted that as best we can, but that's going to be something we need to monitor continually closely, just knowing that we're in a time where the landscape of just what is typical, whether it be raw materials or what implementing a project looks like, tends to change rapidly. And some of the committee may note that many of these examples are the very same ones from October 20th, and some are new. So I'm going to, as we go through these revenues in more detail, I'm going to talk through this. So like I started on the expenditure side last week, I started with a lot of very high level concepts, and we're going down to the details. And this is sort of my last concept slide, where when I get to the end of the details on the revenues, I'm going to be aiming to answer these questions for the committee. Is that, what would be considered if projects could be added to the fiscal year 23 to 27 CIP? First, does the county have the debt capacity? Second, does the county have the related cash needed to fund the debt service on that extra capacity and the actual cash to implement the project? Third, how are the related operating impacts of that planned for with the general fund and the school operating fund? We talked last time about long-range planning taking place in the operating budget and the capital budget, and those two plans working together to talk to and inform each other. Fourth, what is the impact of future flexibility? This will get into some of the charts I'll share related to the county's debt capacity. And then finally, what is the county's ability to execute? We talked about an average annual capital implementation of approximately $35 million a year. Certainly, we're looking at ways we can strategize to improve that in the long term. There will certainly always be an upper limit to that. So with those kind of very high level concepts aside, I'm going to start going into numbers, and I'll say that I think I counted since October 20th, depending on who you are on this committee, you've heard me speak anywhere from 1 to 6 times on financials. And this part of the presentation is going to be a little denser than maybe average of those presentations. So I'm going to take my time. If there are questions as I talk through these numbers, please let me know. I may also say that I'll address that on the next slide, but just want to prepare for the committee. One of the reasons we did not uncover this in the first meeting, because it would have taken quite a amount of time to get through on top of all the expenditure information. And so the first thing that I said earlier is that what we're looking for this committee is to provide us that list of priorities of what should be included in that draft CIP and where would we go next. But I do need to walk through that revenue information because one, part of this committee's charge is to ensure that the county is meeting its financial policies. Second, you all have requested more information and I'm aiming to provide that. And third, I want to provide the committee with the information of what's changed to date and give kind of that understanding and comfort that what I shared before. This committee's work is one step in our long-range planning process. How is what happened to date informed to guide us where we are now? And what are those options in the future that will continue to shape our long-range plan beyond the work of that committee? So this chart shows the from fiscal year 22, that's not a typo. This looks at the revenues to fund current projects as well as the projects that are proposed in the current draft CIP through 27. I'm going to focus my comments on the next slides with the two pieces at the top of the pie chart, the one-time cash and the ongoing transfer from the general fund. And then also the big piece of the pie in yellow, future borrowed proceeds from bonds. Together, those make up 84% of the revenues, and the other 16% for other revenues related to projects or prior borrowed proceeds. I'm not going to talk about in detail because it's usually directly related specifically to a project, and there's not the flexibility to reprogram that funding like there would be some of these other options. For example, I talked about the school's air quality project. We have some federal funding that would be brought along with that. That funding simply can't be taken away and given to another project. There's a scope and a relation there that those are tied to. The prior borrowed proceeds are when the county did its issuance in June. It was borrowing for some expenditures that also were taking place in the current year. So that's also not a piece of the pie that can simply be reshuffled. So with that high level chart, I'm going to now kind of talk about that transfer from the general fund and to capital and debt. So this transfer beyond fiscal year 22, staff is assuming an annual growth rate of 3.8% every year, which is shown on the slide. We'll update fiscal year 23 as we get closer to the annual budget. When we think of the out years, this is an approach of more long-range planning than annual budgeting. The intent of the 5-year projection is not necessarily to project fiscal year 23, but where we might be in fiscal year 27, recognizing that some years may be a little above that, some years will be a little below that. We're going to adjust our plan each year along the way. But what we want to focus on is that long-term trajectory and outlook. 3.8%, that was the number that we generated from looking about the last 15 years or so of general fund revenue growth. That time frame includes a very wide variety of changes in economies. We had the strong period prior to the Great Recession. We had the Great Recession. We had recovery years. We had strong local economy years, the pandemic. We also had years with different boards at different times chose to either raise the real estate tax rate or decrease the real estate tax rate, depending on the circumstances in the given year. So what we felt in this time is that we had a pretty large, good sample size of just a whole realm of possibilities that were there. I'll say that a fair question from the committee was, how can we be so sure it would be 3.8%? And certainly we can't. This is planning. We would need to adjust our plan otherwise. But to give some committees some comfort in terms of like the order of magnitude as that revenue picture changes, I put on this slide at the top kind of 2 what-if scenarios. So if that actual revenue growth was slower over 5 years at 3.3% annually, the total impact over 5 years would be approximately $1 million, that's 0.9 million. On the other hand, if revenues were stronger from this transfer by about 0.5% or 4.3, we would have just over those 5 years a combined impact of around $1 million. So that is certainly not an insignificant amount of money, but in the scope of our total $400 million CIP, that is maybe a more relative assumption than some others we would look at. So how does this transfer work? We have a transfer of approximately 30+ million now that comes from the general fund and goes to capital debt. The very first thing that happens is whatever the county's debt service payment is paid with that funding. And then any remainder of these cash portions of projects are then applied to everything else, either the cash needed to pay for the parts of projects we can't borrow for, or those cash projects which really aren't good candidates for borrowing based on our financial standards. So that's sort of kind of the what's normal, what's already happening we factored in. There are already changes to date for the general fund and also the cash that's going into the CIP. The fiscal year 22, we have made a notable change already based on the Board of Supervisors approval just last Wednesday on December 1st. Through kind of what we've talked about, or what I talked about last time, our 3-6-6-12 kind of method to manage our budget through the pandemic. We've seen through the very strong growth that took place in the fourth quarter of 21 and how that's continued into fiscal year 22, it was appropriate for there to be a revenue update. That revenue update was approximately $21 million. And based on the normal allocation in fiscal year 22 on an ongoing basis in our model going forward, the capital and debt transfer will increase $2.4 million as that share of that revenue update. And again, throwing out a lot of numbers to give that sense of the order of magnitude, a penny on the real estate tax rate is approximately $2.2 million. So this change is more impactful in the long term than that impact. That was not the only revenue impact that impacted the CIP. We go through the allocation of revenues among capital and debt, schools and local government. County government had a share of $7.8 million of that revenue. And the board approved a recommendation to allocate on a one-time basis of that $7.8 million, 4.3 of that to support the capital program, and recognizing that we had just a need for greater cash to support the total needs. This is one of those examples where I talk about our long-range planning of operating capital working together. This is just one of those examples of that. So the other assumption we've made is that, not related to the ongoing transfer, but one-time cash that staff feels we can realistically rely on. So we made an assumption in the out years of the plan, years 2 through 5, or fiscal year 24 to 27, of $8 million of cash that would come from general fund year-end available funding. When we look at what happens historically in a stable economy, this is a reasonable assumption. And this is also informed by the Board of Supervisors' financial policies to invest one-time cash into capital as it is available. So all of these things have to date put the county in a better position for why we were able to have a larger CIP than we did before without the impact of those tax rates before. So I'll move next to borrowed proceeds from bonds. This draft CIP from fiscal year 23 to 27 assumes there will be 230 million in assumed lease revenue bonds. We have made some changes in our practices that have helped kind of prepare this larger CIP than before. One of which is that, in the past, when we did our issuance in June of 21, it was the first time the county issued in 40 years. Working with our financial advisor and our new CFO, we are implementing, I'll say also our Office of Treasury Management, implemented a strategy to have bond issuances every other year. So in fiscal year 23, fiscal year 25, and 27, we would now have an every other year issuance as part of our strategy to issue that $230 million in bonds. I mentioned before, one of the things that have created capacity was the impact of that summer 2021 bond issuance that was done at historically low rates. That created an ongoing savings of $2.5 million in the CIP that is factored into the capacity to get us to this draft CIP. Finally, one of the things we'll do every year is really revisit the assumptions we've made working with our financial advisor or all of the financial staff that we have. And staff feels that it's reasonable. We've had a historical, I'll say historical as in our most recent issuance, to have an assumption that we would have an assumption in the borrowing for eligible projects of 93%. We are comfortable working with our financial advisor and everyone that go into 95% of that. That is a reasonable assumption to make. That is responsible financial management. So what that does is it requires less cash up front, but it will increase debt service cost. The net result of that is approximately $3 million benefit across the 5 years. So all of these examples are just continuing to look at the way we do business, challenging our thinking, looking at our assumptions as we learn new information, and trying to figure out how we can position the county to put ourselves in our best financial position in a responsible way, aligned with our financial policies. So,
Mr. Bowman, may I ask a question about this slide? Just
yes,
briefly?
please.
What is the when you refied the was the interest rate that you were able to get, and secondly, what is the interest rate that you all, for planning purposes, are using as your assumption, please?
I think off the top of my head, I don't have that, but we'll pull that as a follow-up. I know that our staff on the call will be looking up that, and we can provide that both what our planning is now, which is a number we developed with our financial advisor, and then also what took place in June.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I have a guess in June, but I'm not going to say that out loud because I have a feeling Tia will correct me when I say that number. So yeah, we'll certainly provide that as a follow-up. So I'm going to start now from this borrowed proceeds to begin to talk about how we get to our kind of our capacity and our financial policies. So this is a slide the committee has seen before in this format, but it's obviously been a while since it's the first time we've done long range planning in a while. So we start with at the end of fiscal year 21, the county has outstanding debt of just under 199 million. We then look at what our projected bonds. This is the 230 million I mentioned that would be planned to be issued in 23, 25, and 27. So we're adding that now on top of that 198 million. So next, during fiscal year 23-27, we're also paying down debt service and we're retiring debt. The amount of debt that we're going to retire is going to be approximately 114 million. So that gets to this final box for our total projected debt, where we'll be in fiscal year 27. It's a total of 315 million. And I'll point out one of these differences of kind of the 21 to 25 CIP to where we are now in our draft CIP. At the end of 25, that total projected before was around 240 million. And now that number is up to 315 million. It's just another example of why this capital budget is larger than it was before from where we were 2 years ago based on this work that we have been doing. So $315 million is the number that really matters as we begin to look into our financial policies. And this is
Mr. Bowman, could I just ask one question on that previous slide? Under projected bonds for 144 million, I don't need an answer right this second if you got to get it from staff. The number you had us working with is 77 million. So that's what, 69 or 67 million of additional monies. What is the assumption that goes into 144 million when we're talking about 77 million, please?
So the 77 million would refer to I guess the additional projects that are planned. And so this is not just about the top of the pyramid, this is about the full pyramid. So for example, we have the Crozet expansion project that's taking place right now. That project is not yet fully borrowed for. A portion of that was issued in the summer of 21. A portion of that will be issued in year 23 as part of our financial management for what we call kind of just-in-time reimbursement. There's also funding in the maintenance and replacement program, and there are other school projects that we would be implementing in the current budget. I believe it's the funding that was added for the current Mountain View expansion that would have not been borrowed for yet. So it would be the portion of that 77 million that would be borrowed for in the future, plus everything that is in those bottom two tiers of the capital budget.
Very helpful. Thank you.
So we'll jump back to where we stand on the financial slides. And I do appreciate the questions along the way because this is some dense information we're getting through. So the county has two financial policies that we really hold up to make sure we're maintaining our AAA standards. And the first on the left is that our outstanding debt as a percentage of our estimated market value of taxable property should not exceed 2%. On the left, we can see that's the case. As we in the current draft CIP, we do not exceed 1.5% in any of those years. The chart on the right is about our debt service payment, that should not exceed 10% of our general fund and school fund revenues. We can see there, we also have headroom in that chart, as while we do inch up a little bit in the out years, we're not even crossing the 8% threshold to get to the 10%. So we have headroom under both of these policies. And I know one of the questions that will be on the committee's mind and has been looked at in the past is what is our capacity to borrow more? So we'll go to the next slide. And this, we're going to, as we borrow more, the chart that would become a problem in our financial policy adherence is going to be the one on the left. So I've taken the one on the right off the screen. And I'll say, I'm going to emphasize, I had an orange text in here. This is what we know of today. And I'm going to emphasize this is subject to change and likely some, and I'll talk through some of that. But based on what we know today, we would have the capacity to borrow an additional $137 million. That $137 million comes from really that headroom that we see in fiscal year 25 between where we are in the draft CIP and where we are in the top of that limit. And I'll say that's not just a one-time blip. It's because when we look at fiscal year 27, it's a similar figure. It's a little bit more. But this is one sort of just kind of short time situation where we would be kind of approaching our threshold in 25 and then we drop off with steep retirement of debt. I know that the question the committee has looked at before is this is just a 5-year picture. We have debt amortization schedules that go out 20 years. What would that look like in fiscal year maybe 28 or 30? Are we going to be retiring a substantial amount of debt and that would create capacity in 28 and 30? And based on what we're seeing right now, there will be retired debt, but there's not going to be such a dramatic drop off where all of a sudden we create capacity on those 5 years. And we can provide some other information, but just trying to keep our chart simple in 5 years, I left this one as it is. So a couple of these as of today notes I'll make is that, first, we've made a projection for what our calendar year 22 taxable property values will be known. But certainly we'll know what that number will be after the January 1st work is done by our real estate office with the assessment, the evaluation of new construction, land divisions, and so on. So that may change and we can update that as we go along the way. So it just, if we hit that number exactly perfect, that would be really impressive budgeting, but it also might be a little bit lucky. So as we work through the budget process, that 137 could shift a little bit. On the other hand, what we're very mindful of is we're in such a unique time of project cost. And while we've made updates to those to factor in as best we know them today, I want to share almost as like the small print on the disclaimer of the car commercial that we're continuing to do our analysis to look at, what happens with steel prices? Do we see this fundamentally shifting? As we go through the 23 budget process, we can continue to work with what that looks like. But best estimate we have as of today is that we would have 137 million in capacity. So moving on to the next slide is, this committee is likely aware from prior discussions we would have the capacity to borrow more, but there are several considerations that would need to be made at a later date beyond the work of this committee. First is that when we are issuing borrowed proceeds, we need the cash to fund the ongoing debt service for that borrowing, and we need the cash to fund the one-time cash portion of a project. And will the county have that? Second, if those projects are constructed, is the operating budget able to open and operate them? If the county utilizes much of its capacity in the early years, what impact might that have in later years as other community projects arise or new needs become known or the strategic plan is updated or whatever that may be? Essentially any increase to that green line limits the ability to do something else in the future. Fourth, there's a kind of a strategy in financial management about, I'll call it approaching versus maximizing the limit. If the county were to go to maximizing the limit and in a later year there was a decline in total assessed values, if there was a economic recession or something there, it's possible the county could then find themselves above that policy should that take place. I'll say that's a what if. We're not projecting that would happen. Just on the other hand, if growth is even stronger in the 5 years, you can find yourself with even more headroom than you realize now. And so that's just be if there would be just that difference in approach of whether the strategy by the board of supervisors would be to maximize that or to approach it based on the future issuances. So finally, what is the ability and impact to execute that additional 137 million in projects? I should say that's 137 million in borrowing. The actual projects would be greater than 137 million because of the cash requirement. So we'll get into, and this is going to be more of a philosophical question I'm not going to answer today, but what would that realistic timeline be for the county to implement on the current projects of $151 million, the $267 million that's proposed in the draft 23 to 27 CIP, and then any additional borrowing beyond that from 0 to $137 million. So we'll go to the next slide, and this is a slide where, unfortunately, in today's presentation, this will be kind of the dark cloud slide for two facts that I'll share with the committee. First is that $137 million in debt capacity is not enough to fund all requested projects. And it would not be enough, as we mentioned, there's to be determined projects in the future. Those are not included in that 190 million. So the second is that to do any borrowing beyond the draft CIP, additional cash needs to be identified to fund those projects and related debt service. I've talked through in the previous slides those things that we've done to apply cash where we can, whether it be through the investment of one-time funding with our revenue update, relooking at our borrowing assumptions. But those are the things that have been done to get us to this point. That's why I'm sure this slide is disappointing for some to hear. There are possibilities to come with additional cash, and the CIP process is not over. If that cash isn't available now, where might it come from? And this really gets to the point I was making sort of a little bit earlier, maybe it wasn't as clear then, about, again, like where could that cash come from? And I mentioned earlier, this advisory committee is a step in the budget process, and there are going to be future board policy discussions from school board and board of supervisors that could continue to shape this capital picture. So as I kind of imagine this deliverable with the capital advisory committee is that when we leave here, and if we have clear direction of what those priorities are, whether it's elementary school number 2 or local government maintenance, whatever that project is that the committee as a whole wishes us to prioritize, that will give us the guidance that we need as we work with the school board and the board to begin to figure out, here's our strategy approach to address those. This will also allow the board of supervisors and the school board to give them a framework in terms of what might be possible as we're making decisions in the capital budget. So I'll talk through a few of these options just so the committee is aware of them. Certainly these really go beyond the scope and the charge of the committee, as these are decisions appropriate for the school board or the board of supervisors to make. But this committee obviously includes 4 of those members of the elected bodies, and this will be a chance for you all to understand what these are, as these discussions will be coming up in the very near future. So first, as part of that revenue update of approximately $20 million that was approved on December 1st, the school board is going to receive about $10.3 million by formula in fiscal year 22. And I am certain that the schools have numerous operating challenges and complexities and funding that can be applied to. And even that's not my area of expertise, and it's certainly not my place to recommend any use of that funding for the school division. But I will point out what I've shared with school staff as they consider this conversation with the school board, is that as the school board considers how to apply that $10.3 million and just the very unique circumstances of this year update, If they desire to do so, they do have an opportunity to shape what the upcoming CIP looks like based on whether any of that 10.3 would be put in the CIP or not. Again, that's a decision for the school board. Next, it's possible, and this one is going to be much more speculative, but just acknowledging to Ms. Firehawk's comment earlier that we are just watching additional federal funding. The infrastructure bill has been signed, but we have not yet received all the full details yet of how that may be applied. So this one is a little more speculative, but just continuing to recognize that we'll acknowledge that infrastructure and other bills could provide federal funding, which then can be leveraged either for new projects or apply it to existing projects in the plan, which then frees up other projects. So the Board of Supervisors will also have several policy decisions to begin to explore before then. I'll say that this is not all of these are decisions in December, but these are when items are going to be brought forward them to for information to begin making some feedback for staff to how we proceed next. So first, on December 15th, the board's going to receive an annual reassessment update, and then they'll need to consider what to do with that information in the context of the annual budget process as they evaluate the real estate tax rate. This update is a little bit earlier than year coming from our county assessor, and it won't be the final word either because we'll continue to work on new construction and impacts to land division and other things that change our tax base. But this will be some information soon that'll be available to then shape those future long-range policy discussions. Also that day, the board is going to be asked to provide feedback, not action, on potential use of $13.2 million in available 21 year-end funding. Staff is going to prepare a recommendation for the board to consider, and a component of that recommendation will include additional support for capital. But there will be other items in there as well, and that'll be really for the board's feedback to take action on in the context of the 23 budget. So also that day, I talked before where the county now has enabling authority from the state that did not exist 2 years ago. Two of those areas that are of note are for meals taxes and transient occupancy taxes. So the board has expressed some interest just to learn more about what those options are, what would they look like. We'll be bringing back some preliminary information just to see how that could be considered in the county's total financial strategy and picture in terms of how we fund all of our programs. And then, as I mentioned for the schools, this is especially true for local government. We are continuing to look at the American Rescue Plan Act funding to determine what is the best way to allocate that in fiscal year 23. The Board of Supervisors received an update in the summer where they directed to allocate some funding immediately and reserve some for the 23 budget process, recognizing we had a longer time frame to spend that money. And then finally, we're continuing to launch the federal infrastructure bill and just anything else that may come our way from the federal government. Then the final slide is really just the 23 budget development process as a whole is when a lot of these discussions are going to be coming together. So, excuse me, while maybe some of that previous slide may have felt like almost a stopping point for the CIP of we've used all our cash, we can't pursue any debt capacity. This committee's input is going to be very important in terms of as those policies are worked on, what are those areas that can provide clarity and priorities and direction to staff to prepare for as we head into the fiscal year 23 budget process. So if and when revenues improve, what would be considered? And these are going to be the answers, if you remember all the way back before starting going into this revenue detail, the high level questions that we started with. So first is, does the county have debt capacity? The answer is yes. Based on what we know today, we could issue an additional $137 million in borrowed proceeds. Does the county have the related cash needs? Just for some perspective, each $20 million of borrowing, that would require $1.5 million in ongoing cash and $1 million in one-time cash to actually execute on the project. What would be the funding source of that cash? Well, that will be a future discussion in the 23 budget process, going back to all those options that are available in the on the previous slide. How are those related operating debts planned for in the general fund and school fund? Unfortunately, that's not a question I can answer today because it will vary wildly based on the project or package of projects that are considered. What is the impact to future flexibility? As that borrowing is issued, as I alluded to earlier, and that green line creeps up to the limit, that does limit future funding options in the future, and it would establish higher debt service payments also beyond the 5-year period of fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 27. And like the operating impacts, the county's ability to execute would vary based on the project. Certainly a project where the county own the land, would be easier to execute on a project where the county did not own the land, and what other barriers may be out there. So I keep glancing on my second screen, so I'm just keep looking for hands to pop up because we've gone through a lot of really dense information on the revenues. And I'll pause for just one moment because this really brings us back to that draft CIP for the committee's recommendation. So we do have a hand up, Ms. Firehawk.
Yes, you won't like this question. I'm just curious if you feel like being a little bit of a magician and telling us if the county has a sense about property values. In other words, is it the sense that their assessments are going to be higher and therefore there will be greater revenue? I mean, it seems anecdotally like that would be the case, but I don't know if you just want to just wait till January. But.
Yeah, I'll share what our current assumption is.
Okay.
I'll say it would really be appropriate for the county assessor to address that to the board on December 15th. But for some perspective, and I guess from this basic information, people can draw what conclusions they want, is that in calendar year 2021, our current year on January 1st, there was a reassessment of about 1.4%. That reflected a strong residential market. Maybe strong is not the right word. I think the percentage was higher than 1.4%, but that increase was mitigated by the impact on the commercial sector in the pandemic. Depending on how you count, commercial properties are about 15 to 20% of the county's tax base. So that is significant when there are two various tracks on that. We've made an assumption, and we shared it with the Board of Supervisors. For right now, our assumption in 22 has not changed, that there would be an increase of 1.75% in that reassessment. But obviously that will change. So back in the budget, we expected something stronger than the current year, but we have not changed it yet because it would be appropriate to wait for the information that's coming on December 15th. I believe Supervisor Price had her hand up next.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. And I think slides 27 and 28, if you could go back to 27 real quick. Yeah, I think these two slides really kind of bring up the whole crux of the situation. We've got from 27, it looks like, we've got some pretty substantial allocation of funds that we can make a decision on. And then if you go back to 28, please. But here are really the critical questions, because we may be able to afford the construction, but then we've got to look at the operating costs that come after that. So it's really a challenge. And I tend to be more conservative on concerns over future expenditures than perhaps some people may be. And just sort of anecdotally, last night at the TJPDC meeting, one of our neighboring counties has already started their assessment work to the part of reporting now, and have shown residential values to have increased substantially, which I think we're seeing in the real estate market. And I again, being somewhat conservative, I then worry about a bubble burst or an adjustment or whatever they have on that. So we do have additional capacity, but we have to look at how the utilization of that capacity now may impact or constrain us in the future. So I think what you've covered here in these two slides, Mr. Bowman, has really, really been valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Alcaro had his hand up next.
Well, thank you. I just have a couple of quick questions. On this slide, for each 20 million in borrowing, it's necessary to have 1.5 million in ongoing cash. And I'm assuming that's an assumption of 20 years for the debt.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And so, and it's 1 million in one-time cash. That takes me back to something that I missed what you had said in terms of, for 1 penny of an increase in real estate taxes or any taxes, what was the amount that's generated by 1 penny?
In fiscal year 22, that's approximately $2.2 million.
2.2. Okay, thank you.
Looking for other, oh, sorry, Supervisor Pizzo, sorry, I missed.
Okay. Thank you. So the question you're asking, what would be considered if projects can be added? Will you be putting up a slide in another slide for 28, 29, 31 that would list the previous projects that are not going to be funded? Is that what you're looking for from us?
Yeah, yes, I think we can
Okay.
get to the slides anywhere in the presentation, but this is sort of the kind of the work of the committee is I think of this outcome at the end, providing that recommendation to the county executive to consider. Give these on slide 27, all these unknowns, but also possibilities out there. And based on just the kind of the timing and just the scope of this committee and our timeline, we won't be able to address all of those things. I will not be able to provide all those answers to you all to assess those things.
Right.
But what we can provide through this committee is that clear intent and priorities so that we know as these decisions are made, staff would have guidance on where to go to inform the upcoming budget process.
Okay. And the items you're looking for, the projects you're looking for, or is that one slide, and I didn't get the number, I apologize, but it's a one slide that shows two different sets of projects that will not be funded, school
Yeah,
and county.
We could go back kind of all the way, Ryan, if you don't mind. It is slide 9.
Good.
And thank you, Ryan, for running the slideshow today. You've kind of been on a roller coaster, jumping back several times. So
There it is.
Yes. Well, I guess we'll go one more slide because I think there's a series of questions. And I have this on the slide later, but I'll talk about it now. I think there's kind of a few questions for the committee. First, like, is there anything that I need to provide to clarify based on the content we're providing today? And you all are already jumping in with those questions. I think the second question then is really starting with this list, not even the unfunded projects, but in this current draft CIP, is there anything in here that should be considered? This was a staff prepared list. We may not have it correct, and that's okay. This is where really the committee's judgment comes in place of priorities. So if there are projects or issues where the committee had uncertainty that this was the right starting point, that would be the first thing that we would look for some committee feedback on. Now then from there, when we moved to the next slide, thank you, Ryan, it becomes to the question of recognizing that based on that capacity and what the unmet requested, or I'll say, all requested projects can't be fully funded within the confines of the county's financial policies. So then what is that next tier of projects that could be considered should revenues improve? And then it kind of, the question is, we may not figure that out today. So what is that additional information that would be needed to assist the committee identifying this tier when we get back together on December 10th, assuming that we do? Then I think in my mind, there's a longer range question that doesn't even need to be addressed on either today or the 10th, but we've said from the start that this capital process will be different and that we're doing a 5-year update and we're going to revisit the 5 years in fiscal year 24 to 28. So as we think about not just what we know today, but what's going to happen in the spring through the budget process and that leads into the next budget process that follows, what additional information will be helpful as we shape future CIPs. But I think today, this has been a long answer to your question. Start with, is that draft the right starting point? And then from there, what would be that tier of projects be that the committee would be looked to direct staff? That would be the first place that we would look to prioritize if and when revenues improve and provide the ability to do so.
Mr. Bowen?
Yes.
One comment would be a starting point would be what kind of monies are we discussing? Because I don't think that everybody's going to want to just max everything out. But because if that's the case, I could come up with $181 million, including the original, and I could come up with 122, paring that big one back. But if we had an idea of what amounts are involved, then we can really start to make some decisions and strategies. And if I understand we're being kind of cut into one pool for the county and one pool for the schools. And in years past, it's been a conversation of both, so that there was involvement on both sides. But I mean, that would be a great starting point in my mind.
Several hands are shot up, and I also asked the committee too. So much of our dialogues and shared information has been kind of questions of myself and staff. But certainly, as you all have questions to respond to each other, I'm trying to wash the hands, but I know I'm not getting the order quite right. Supervisor Price was next.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. And I concur with what Mr. Alcaro just said, that without money, without figures, it's kind of hard to actually give opinions. But again, back to this particular slide on the county government side, I don't know if full requested increases for the last two items for the transportation leveraging program and the baseline maintenance and replacement amounts, but of this particular list on the county government side, those strike me as the two that I would really hope that we might be able to put some measure of additional funding towards, because transportation is one of our major issues for every development proposal that comes up, as well as just our current situation. And again, back to my previous comment, if you don't take care of what you've got, then the bills just get higher later on. Thank you.
Supervisor Lepisto-Curtley.
Yes, and I understand what Supervisor Price is saying regarding the transportation leveraging program. If that's something that we need to do sooner than later, that's good. I mean, we just had an RTA meeting yesterday, and we're quite a bit of ways, frankly, of getting our whole bus transportation, jaunt and microtransit, getting that going and on board. So I would work for the timing there. In other words, if that's years out, then we may not need to do the full funding request right now. But on the other hand, it may be more advantageous, economical to do it right now. That's something that staff's going to have to look at. I'm looking at on the school side, and I agree with Mr. Alcaro that if we don't know the price that's associated with each one of these, it's hard to make a decision. And we could probably blow the entire 131 million just on building a new elementary school, or a couple of them. So my question is, I'd want to know whether or not that money, what it would cover, because these are all good projects, but also, once again, I'm bringing up the proposal of maybe a bond or a referendum to be able to build another school. I mean, I think it's very, in my opinion, I think it's very important to keep up with that aspect and not put all of our money into one basket, so to speak, but maybe ask the community regarding a bond or a referendum to keep up with what is needed for our schools. And I'm talking about new schools, not renovations. Thank you.
Thinking in response to these questions, because I do understand, as someone who works with dollars all the time in this planning, is that it certainly is easier when you know the dollar amounts of how far you would want to go into that 130 million to provide that. But I think what is kind of the challenging part as I think through that is really how far you can go depends on future decisions to be made by the board and the school board. And so right now, unfortunately, unless there's reprioritization of what's in the draft CIP, there's not the additional cash to provide that funding. Whether the county issues lease revenue bonds or general obligation bonds through referendum, there will be a cash need regarding the project that would be needed for that. Now, if those the boards have shared fast, if there's revenue that was kind of communicated as part of that, that may be a different thing. But without the information on what future boards, many of you all being on those, what they may take, I think that's sort of the chicken and egg process that we're in. But I have another comment I was going to say, but I don't want to. I'm going to give the committee as much time as they can to discuss. I believe Dr. Akoff had her hand up first.
I think you probably already covered it. I do understand that we don't know all the revenue numbers, but I think it's very difficult to look at these projects without saying, here's our baseline scenario that you did provide. But what if we added these, these three things, and then have a middle and an aggressive strategy. And somewhere the revenues will fall, and then we can make that decision. But just again, and I said this last time, and I'm a stuck record, all our core schools, the average age of our core school facilities is in the neighborhood of a half a century. And the renovations, all of them, but particularly in our concept of a high school for the 21st century, was reconfiguring and rebuilding parts of the high schools, and then in addition having the high school centers, because this is not one center forevermore. And it's and when we went through our, I think, very thorough and conservative process of saying, what can we do instead of spending 150 million or so on a new high school, we came in much, much lower than that. But now we're looking at 32 million, which I would be grateful for, but in my view, needs to be coupled with the restructuring of our other schools. So even if it's a nod toward keep putting that in the capital budget, I think we need to start making some progress on that. So I would love to see the second elementary school and at least some funding for renovations. And I understand that the total amount proposed by the Long Range Planning Advisory Committee is unrealistic, but we need to start making progress on those schools because it has a direct impact on the learning of our students. But anyway,
I may just make one comment before I ask Mr. Alcara to speak, as I've been listening to this committee. I'll suggest a deliverable. If this is helpful to you, please tell me, and if not, we can come up with something different. But I think for those projects that are kind of listed on those two slides, what is the total cost of that project? What would be the amount of kind of cash needed, both on an ongoing basis and a one-time to fund that? It sounds like that would be information that if we were to provide before December 10th, would assist the committee with their recommendation.
I think it would be very useful.
Yes. And I'll share that as I've been taking notes, we haven't heard from all committee members, but certainly there have been a number to express the support for the transportation leveraging program, the elementary school center number 2. We've also heard discussion around local government maintenance and the school renovations as well. And I'm going through my notes, so I'm going to apologize if we forgot one to date. But I think as I think about today is making progress towards this meeting. And this is kind of, as I listen to you all, I'm kind of thinking, what are those deliverables I can provide? I have one, but I'm going to continue to hear your all's feedback. And thank you, Mr. Alcara, for letting me chime in.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and thank you for your comments. I agree with Dr. Acuff in terms of looking at these lists. I mean, there are some items on the slide before. There's one item on the slide before, and there are that I think could be actually taken off because of the governmental grant covering the vast majority of that for the indoor air quality. That is going to be a pretty major part of the cost of that. And I would see the land acquisition for the Western feeder pattern on the next one as something that could get pushed back into future years, not way out there, but out there. And the middle school capacity study. I think that's important to do, but I think that could be taken off the CIP list. In very much strong keeping with Supervisor Price's comment about increases to baseline maintenance and replacement and technology amounts. 2 years ago, when we were last in person for these meetings, we had requested $1 million out of our technology needs, which is $8 million, and it was declined. Technology is, just as it is in the county and all the different departments, so important in the schools and for learning. So the elementary school number 2 and the renovations. I mean, it's $105 million that the LRPAC had recommended for renovation costs. And I think we have to get a start on that and figure out how to do that over the next 7 years or so. Thank you.
I believe Ms. Firehawk had her hand up next.
Yeah, and this is just something philosophical I want to say, putting on my planning commissioner hat for a moment. You know, I guess I've had it, supposedly had it on all along, but anyway, as we get ready to redo the comprehensive plan and we look at land use in the county and we look at creating a future land use map, and we also look at recommending what the zoning should be for these areas, and some areas may change. You know, I feel like one big piece of the information that we're always missing is what are the costs of that recommended growth. In other words, you know, the analysis is needed, not by this committee and not today, but in order to have a realistic plan for the future, so we're not always playing catch up. We need to analyze what is the outcome of, say, you know, recommending higher zoning for various areas in terms of schools. Now, if you know, taking all the assumptions of the new comp plan that we will be embarking on, does that mean that the county needs to build 10 more schools in the next 20 years? I mean, that sounds like a crazy number, but I would like, as a planning commissioner, to have a much more realistic number on which to make judgments in terms of, you know, what we should recommend for future land use and growth, because you know, we have to pay for all this growth, and schools are the biggest expense. And, you know, we see these numbers on land use maps that say this, you know, these parcels are recommended to be upzoned to 6 to 36 units per acre, you know, and then over hundreds and hundreds of parcels. What does that mean for our schools? And so you know, should we be tamping down what we're actually putting in the comprehensive plan, because there's no way in heck that our county can or is willing to support that through increased tax revenues from real estate increases. And, you know, I'm also one who thinks that our real estate tax rate is quite low when compared to other places, but that's just me, and I'm not on the board of supervisors, so I'll stop now. But I really do need that kind of analysis for the planning commission to be able to make a realistic strategy for the future, because we're always going to be playing catch up, and we're always going to be having these bad conversations about sacrificing our kids, you know, because we can't afford schools. I just find this really disheartening, and it's not new to me, but I just wanted to put that out there, that we need to do this analysis. Maybe you know, our budgeting staff can be helping us with that as we make the next plan for the next 5 years.
Mr. Morris has his hand up. You're on mute, sir.
I would just like to second what Karen just stated, that I don't think it's only important for the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission. It's going to be critical if we're going to sell this to the general public. We need to sell it to the general public. The why is going to be extremely important.
Supervisor Lepista Curley.
Yes, the one question, I go back to the full requested increase to transportation leveraging program. That's also listed on slide 9, but minus the word full.
Yeah, so what's included in the first tier, and I believe, just take a look at this list to make sure I don't state anything incorrectly. Everything in the first tier of those projects, at least was identified, is included, except for the transportation leveraging request was not all there. No, let me back up a moment, because I can already expect a follow-up question. Certainly, as we consider the total package of school needs with the relation of the strategy to Center 2 and other renovations. So I think as those projects were identified as they came through there, those would be included. The transportation leveraging program is unique where it was not fully funded. This provided some funding to make progress, but it did not. And just like these other projects, cash became the limiting factor because that is a heavy cash project compared to others, which are borrowed proceeds. But yeah, so certainly what I've heard from the several members of this committee is that transportation would be a portion of what you all look to in that first tier in terms of if we could do more, what would be included.
Okay, and I do notice that it's slated for FY24, which it might be good because it then might give us the needed time on the transportation side to get everything. We're going through some studies now as to what type of transportation that we need to address what we need to do for people to get from point A to B. And there's some exciting new developments there, one called microtransit. But so we're looking at those. So the fact that this isn't going to be till FY24 is probably a good thing. Thank you.
Mr. Alcaro.
I just wanted to comment that I agree very much with what Mr. Morris just said. It's a matter of convincing the public. And one of the things that we had pretty much as a cornerstone when we did the referendum in 2016, and that I've always believed throughout my business career, is that price is only an issue in the absence of value. People will sign on for something if they see the value to it. And one of the values that we put in the 2016 referendum, which I think would be an important part, which gets into renovations, is we touched every single school with monies from that referendum. Every single school saw some and benefit from it. And the more and more we're able to do through CIP that touch all the members of the community, and maybe with a referendum, there's a value to them and they see the value.
Amen. Amen.
Mr. Henry has his hand up.
Thanks, Mr. Bowman. Really just responding to the comment around transportation leveraging the program. And I just wanted to get some clarity on this. It's my understanding that the funding that is proposed in the baseline and then even the augment that is not in the funding line currently ties to our infrastructure project. So it would be the county's participation in smart scale revenue sharing. It would be roads and sidewalks. It is not for transit, at least not currently. So could that be used for transit facilities? Is a question, and I think it would be appropriate within the CIP. But anything that would be around extension of operational bus routes, things like that, with our partners would come from the operating side. And, Mr. Bowman, can you comment on that or clarify it?
You're exactly correct. We would the services through CAT and JAUNT and anything that may come out of the Regional Transit Partnership with the operating budget. The Transportation Leveraging Program really speaks to those more infrastructure pieces that we leverage with the state. Now, in the future world where transit is different, perhaps I could provide capital infrastructure, but as it's designed right now. But anyway, I feel like I'm just repeating Mr. Henry, so thank you. You are correct.
Thanks, Andy.
Supervisor Lisa Curley, is that the new hand?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Henry, for that clarification, because I'm kind of feeling it's what we have listed here might be, well, it wasn't clear to me. Maybe it was clear to everybody else, but it wasn't clear to me. So I thank you very much. That's a horse of a different color, as they say. Thank you.
Just waiting a moment to see if any other hands or comments pop up. We just pulled down the presentation just to help with the discussion, but we can certainly pull that back up if needed. So hearing nothing, I'll kind of share a little bit. I think a lot of this discussion has really spoken to those questions that were on staff's mind. Pull these up as I juggle screens. So I think just to recap what I said before we got into discussion, the first thing is clarifying questions in the content provided. I feel like we've addressed that along the way. There were a couple of questions that came up in the discussion around our interest rate assumptions from June and also planning for the future. And there may be, as I look through my notes, we may have another, but I know our team is taking very good notes and we can provide that as a follow-up to the next meeting. We've talked next about really, for those projects not included in the draft CIP, what are some of those tier projects that would be considered should revenues improve? Now, I've heard from several members around school renovations, the transportation leveraging funding, and the maintenance and replacement program being those priorities. And I just want to pause for a moment in case in my notes I either misread something or if I forgot something that someone said, I just ask them to please raise their hand. Not to say that those other projects aren't important. Those are the things that people have said. These are the things that should revenues improve, we'd sort of look to first. And now the other piece, we kind of had the sub question of what additional information is needed to assist the committee to identify that tier. What I heard from several all is that we can provide before the December 10th meeting. I'll say I'm presuming we're going to have that at this point, as I sort of suspected before we even began this meeting. So we could provide a list of sort of all the projects. Here's the total cost. Here's what it would take in cash to implement. Here's what it would take to pay for the debt service on that. Here's what it would take for the ongoing operating impact. And certainly some of these projects would have time components. And we can prepare that in a framework, knowing that while staff isn't able to provide this total revenue picture, this will give some committee some perspective in terms of how far into that 137 million might be reasonably possible. With that, any other deliverables or information that may assist the committee, or if I said it would be great to have a column on that sheet with something else, what can we provide that would help you all?
I would just like to see the baseline assumptions with numbers or the baseline projects, sort of a middle of the road and maybe a more aggressive scenario. So we can, and maybe if we could, I don't know if you have the software to be dynamic and plugging things in during the course of a meeting. I know we've had that at some of our school board meetings years ago, but I mean, as you've correctly pointed out, we don't know what the revenue picture is going to look like, but I think we should ultra conservative, middle, and aggressive. I think we should have those priorities identified going in our recommendation to the BOS.
And I think what I can share as well, if I didn't make it clear, is that can be the list for all projects. Here's what's in the draft CIP originally. Here's this next tier of I call it a draft priority tier, which you all provided some preliminary feedback on. And then everything else that I mentioned today, because though it didn't get mentioned in detail, it doesn't mean that couldn't be reconsidered at a later date. So we'd have the list of sort of everything from top to bottom that we've talked about.
I think that's important because when we also talk about school renovation, and that could take up the entire budget perhaps. And if maybe then we say, okay, that needs to go out for some other kind of funding. But to have those amounts, I agree with Dr. Acuff, to be able to have a, low, middle, high type scenario would be helpful, in my opinion.
And just, I think Ms. Firehook questioned how many schools we're going to need down the line. I mean, I think we do have to think beyond this 5-year period. And in the Long Range Planning Advisory Committee, we will be maybe in the 7-year area needing another elementary school in the Western feeder pattern. And land acquisition costs were part of that recommendation. Also, the high school center model is such that it was contemplated there would be more than one center. So that's probably more like 10 years out, but we know those two things for pretty sure will be needed. So the point being, pushing off the second elementary school now we'll be facing the same issue down the road. So I would be in favor of doing it sooner.
Supervisor Price.
Thank you. I have to agree with what several other of the members have said in terms of longer term expenditures towards construction. And I think I have to hear from the school board in terms of where they anticipate the greatest growth and the greatest need may be. So I clearly would support that. Another area, and I don't know if this is the right time to bring it up, but I would love to see us look at expanding our parks and trails in some of those areas. And if this isn't the right time for that conversation, I understand. But you know, one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is how much our community members need their outdoor recreation facilities. And these are the sorts of things that there's an initial construction cost, but I would think the maintenance on things like trails would be relatively low as opposed to some higher operational costs. And just as an example, over Thanksgiving, I was in Columbia, South Carolina, and they have an absolutely fabulous river walk. And just a couple of months ago, I did the loop around Charlottesville, Albemarle County on the Ravenna trails, and we are so far behind some other communities, but those could be used for recreation, for transportation to and from work and shopping. And so anyway, I'll stop at that. But that's an area I really would like to see us expand some on.
Thank you. I think that's one question we can spend some time at our last meeting on December 10th. I could have had a question in my back pocket is when we do this in fiscal year 24 to 28, what is some of that information and things that this committee would be looking for? Whether that be one thing that has been, it's varied over the years, but there's something called a capital needs assessment. It's not as scientific as the first 5 years, but sort of looks out in years 6 through 10. And that may be one where, with our uncertainty, part of the, for a few reasons, wasn't included last year or this year. And to include just for the committee's awareness, to have that more formally documented for some of those things that may be out there. If there's other topics around long-term trail network or school construction, wherever it may be, we could sort of, as part of our debrief with this committee at our last meeting, spend some time talking through that.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. I really appreciate you putting that into a timeline context.
I just want to ask maybe a clarifying question as we think about this list we're providing for December 10th of kind of what's in and what's not. I'm not, well, my initial thought and reaction was not to include the two bottom layers of the pyramid, the 151 million currently funded and the maintenance and replacement obligation currently. And I see Supervisor Price nodding in her head. I'll say that will also make for a much more manageable list for the community to work through. So great. Well, it'll be just the top of the pyramid and what is not excluded. Well, I'm just kind of looking through my questions, what we achieved today. We've been through a lot of really dense information. Though we're not done, the feedback the committee has been provided has been helpful, and also how we can really kind of support you along the way. I offered at the end of last meeting that if there's other thoughts or questions that come up, please feel reach out to us. We can talk that through. Even just basic understanding. I'd actually thank Dr. Acuff and Ms. Alfaro. They reached out to me and took me up on my offer to kind of talk through where we were. And just for the other committee members, it wasn't really to give them any inside knowledge, but sort of about what are some of those questions they had and how would those be addressed today. So I don't know that we hit everything they were looking for, but I hope we were able to at least make progress to have a continued productive meeting on this 10th. So please, we're here as staff to support the committee. If you have questions or other thoughts, please continue to reach out to us.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. And I do have one request because I'm not familiar, and I hope this isn't something big. I'm sure it may be something that's already in some sort of a format that we could get. Is the list of the prior approved projects that are in the $151 million? Not for anything other than just education.
Yeah, that was one of the attachments we sent last night. You may have not had a chance to see it. So
I guess I didn't. Okay, thank you.
yeah, yeah, there's an attachment there. If that doesn't get to the level of detail or anything else, please let us know.
Perfect. Thank you.
And Mr. Bowman, mentioning you by name, but as not only for your own individual contributions and input for this, but everyone that you've worked with on county staff. It's incredibly complicated what y'all are working with, and you are providing it to us in a very comprehensive and understanding fashion. And I just want to express appreciation for the great work that y'all are doing. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, much appreciated. And Maya, you've been very quiet for this meeting. You've certainly had a lot of thoughts in terms of how to help this committee be successful. Would you have any comments or anything to add?
No, thank you, Andy. I do not have anything to add.
Okay.
He's been busy educating Jono and me.
All right, well, we have our list of follow-ups, and this is, I hate to say it, and potentially inadvertently run the meeting over, but this will now be our second meeting. We've ended slightly ahead of time. So as everyone was hopefully able to enjoy their Thanksgiving a little sooner, hopefully they can enjoy their weekend a little sooner. And we'll be in touch with more information, and we'll see you all again on December 10th, unless there's any final thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.